I am so delighted to have with me Chris Hayes, who's one of the most thoughtful and prolific and interesting people on television, and has a huge amount to say about where we are as a nation and where we ought to be going. And Chris, I just love this book.
Thank you very much.
This is a new book. One thing we're doing here is we're getting the most interesting people who I can find, who I can have in my office right here.
Which is a lovely office, for the record.
Well, it's sort of crowded. It's kind of funky. But anyway, this book I love. A Colony in a Nation, which Chris, I was really surprised when I read the book, because I didn't have any preconceptions. I didn't know what a colony in a nation really was, and I thought the metaphor was fabulous. And maybe you can. I mean, where did you get the metaphor from?
So the origin of the book, I think, is the reporting that I was doing in particularly Ferguson and Baltimore, where, particularly in Ferguson, it just the law enforcement there really felt like an occupying army. I mean, it really felt. I mean, there's a YouTube video I describe in there of watching police fire a tear gas canister into someone's front yard. When people are just in their own yard and they're saying, this is our property. I thought about, as I watched that video and I was in Ferguson, I thought about the Gadsden flag of the Tea Party and of the revolutionary generation, which is "Don't tread on me," right? So I was sort of thinking about this kind of sense of occupation and rebellion against it, and the indignity and humiliation of a certain kind of policing, and how much that was in tension with what our kind of inheritance from the sort of revolutionary generation was. And I went back and I listened to Richard Nixon's 1968 speech, Miami Beach, where he talks about law and order, and he at one point says, Black Americans want the same as white Americans. They don't want to just get, money from the government. They don't want to be a colony in a nation. And I thought to myself, like, that actually captures something about these two distinct legal regimes that we have in the country.
And they are really distinct. And Richard Nixon inadvertently put his finger on something that is a powerful metaphor, even more powerful today than it might have been there. He was talking about law and order. But what I was struck by over and over again, the images that you came up with, the stories and the analysis of how there is a group of people in this country who regards themselves, who, in terms of power and their lack of power over the people who are actually making decisions about their lives, they are very much like colonies.
Yeah, and the first-person experience of it is not the first-person experience or the collective experience of that you would anticipate in a democracy. And again, I haven't experienced this firsthand. This is born of the reporting. And it's very hard, I think, if you live in the nation, right? How often do you interact with the cops? Not that much. In fact, the ideal amount of interaction with cops is zero. Exactly.
And
zero.
you think of the cops as, well, they're there if I need them, maybe.
That's right. Yeah, right. They are in the background. I say in the book, it's like your laptop's operating system.
Yeah.
Right. Like the criminal justice system is doing something in the background. You're doing your life. You're like teaching and writing, getting coffee or whatever. In the colony, it's like a computer virus. It's interrupting all the time. The amount of just the sheer number of interactions, the sheer amount of contact, the sort of penetrative nature of it. It's just very hard to get your head around if you don't experiencing that.
The criminal justice system is a system that is continuously invading the colony.
That's right.
And it's taking away a lot of people in the colony.
And people are getting enmeshed in it in constant points of contact. I think sometimes pop culture gives us a very wrong impression of what our criminal justice system does. You watch CSI and Law and Order, and there's like fancy laboratory technology, and they're solving crimes. It's like go to a courthouse in a big city at 2 in the morning, and it's just a conveyor belt of bodies being moved through, arraigned, and that's happening 24 hours a day. It's like Lucy with the chocolates. Like, that's what the system's actually doing.
And it's taking people from the colony into it before they have trials. One of the big revelations here, and a lot of people don't know this, and they ought to know this, is that in many jails, in many municipal areas, there are more people awaiting trial
That's exactly right.
than there are who have been convicted. I mean, the jails are filled with people who have not been convicted.
And often who have been offered bail but can't afford it, right? So that, in a very literal sense, they are only imprisoned because they cannot make the payment, right?
In fact, even in so-called liberal California, there's a piece of legislation being debated right now as to whether there ought to be some help for people who are poor and who can't meet bail. I mean, bail itself, if you're in the colony, bail means something very different than if you're in the nation.
And you have folks, right? So there's so many different points of contact, right? So there's pre-trial, there's awaiting trial, then if people get out and they have a plea but it has probation, if you miss a probation date, you're constantly sort of having this back and forth. And that's not even that's the court system, right? Then there's policing. So then there's just the routine, going about your life. And in the stop and frisk decision, in which a federal district court judge, found it unconstitutional, New York's stop and frisk at trial, the judge talks about, when she talks about the statistics in some of these neighborhoods, if you're a young man of color, how often it is, this once or twice a week you're getting stopped by a police officer for no reason. She says, this is not liberty. This is not, there's no constitutional defense of a life that one lives with this level of invasion.
And the fact that it's not liberty is something that people who are not in the colony, who are in the rest of the nation, actually can't understand. I mean, if you don't have a life of liberty, if you don't have that kind of freedom, you are actually under a tyranny.
That's right. And in fact, one of the sort of rhetorical projects of the book, and particularly in the second chapter, is to say that in a quite literal sense, this is what the founders rebelled against. What I call in the book the first era of stop and frisk, the invasiveness of the British law enforcement model to collect taxes, which was much more about policing than it was the taxes. It was the method by which they were enforcing them, the constant searches and surveillance. That, in the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson says, complaining of the crown, he has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance.
So you have the framers of the Constitution who are incredibly sensitive to tyranny in the form of constant invasion that is also arbitrary and unpredictable, exactly what a lot of people in this country who are black Americans are subjected to all the time. And yet, obviously, the framers of the Constitution didn't consider black people to be full citizens to begin with.
Right.
But what you are saying is that they still aren't full citizens, something we've already known, but quite literally are not.
I think the experience of citizenship, particularly in sort of areas of concentrated poverty, disinvestment, and intense policing, the experience of citizenship is deeply circumscribed experience. And that's something that's a problem for all of us because it's a violation of our fundamental democratic principles.
That's important. It's a problem for all of us. Now, why can't somebody read this or learn about all of this and say, well, I'm white and I'm, middle class or upper middle class and I'm horrified at this, but it's not really my problem?
Here's why. A few reasons. One is, there are certain things, and this is something that you've spoken incredibly eloquently about, you and I have talked about on our show. There's certain policy that happens that has no real democratic push behind it. It's really special interests, right? The bankruptcy bill, right? Like, there was no mass movement for the bankruptcy bill. It was a bunch of banks essentially working, their lobbying. That's not the case with this system. This system was brought about by democratic will. There's no backroom deal special interest. It's perpetuated by certain special interests, prison unions, local police unions. There's a bunch of different institutions now that support it.
But they're not overwhelming.
No, it was brought into play by democratic will. A majority of Americans voted to put a minority under lock and key. We democratically brought about a system in which 1/4 of the world's prisoners are Americans. That was us. And so we have to unmake it as a democratic project.
But when you say democratic, you mean small d democratic.
Yes.
But I was in a democratic, capital D, democratic administration that did some of this.
Yes.
I mean, Bill Clinton is not obviously the sole
No.
perpetrator here, but he and his administration that crime bill was, fed right into this stuff.
Well, and I think it's really important to think about that in the context of the politics that drove it, right? So when we talk about the system that we've created, first of all, it's literally thousands of systems. Every municipality, every county, every state legislature, district attorney's office. I mean, but what happened starting around 1968 and going forward for about 34 years is they all start moving in the same direction. And the metaphor I use in the book is that it's like a magnet pulling iron filings into an arc of force around it. So the question is, like, what's the magnet, right? So the individual filings are these little beats of policy, right? The three-strike law over here, mandatory minimums over there, parts of the crime bill over here, right? But the force there is the politics of fear and law and order that's pulling on everyone. It's pulling on Bill Clinton when he comes up through Arkansas.
Yep.
When he comes up through Arkansas politics and gets a sense of the power of law and order politics, particularly when he runs afoul of it at different points in his career. It's pulling on New York City mayors and council people in Detroit. And so everybody's moving in this direction so that you start to align all these different jurisdictions, and they're all pushing for more punishment, more crackdown, and crucially, more focus on order maintenance, and control of certain populations.
And so when they say law and order, as you say in the book, it's really about order, and it is in response to fear, and that fear is a fear of disorder,
yes,
and also of violence. And yet, as you point out, crime has declined dramatically. In fact, it was declining even before Bill Clinton, and a lot of these things were put into effect. Interestingly, as you point out, we don't know exactly why crime began to decline.
It's sort of one of the great sociological mysteries of our time. I mean, just to give a sense of this, I mean, the crime wave that happens from, say, basically 1966 to 91, which is a useful way of bounding it, is extraordinary. It is, 700% increase in homicides over that period of time in the country. The country gets way more dangerous, and not just in isolated areas, across different, in small towns and big towns and suburbs, in all kinds of regions of the country. So there's something real happening, and politicians feed off the fear that is being engendered by that. Then you hit 1991, and it starts reversing itself. And during this period of time, something really interesting happens, which is that every year crime's going down, but the politics that were constructed in that first 25 years keep going along. And the prison system keeps growing. So in the beginning, you might think, okay, well, the inputs to outputs match a little bit here, right? If homicide goes up,
right,
if it doubles, we would imagine we'd have more people in jail. At a certain point, you hit the inflection point, and
it keeps going.
It keeps going, because the system is now sustaining itself. And not just sustaining itself, there's also a kind of cargo cult that gets built. Right? Because in the absence of actually understanding why this remarkable thing happens in which crime goes up and then down, there's a sense that if we stop doing what we're doing, we're going to invite it back.
Right. And also you have, part of the cargo is that you have politicians who look back on other politicians who have really done very well on this law and order theme.
Absolutely.
And they say to themselves, and their advisors say, hey, you can make a lot of hay on this same law and order business.
I've always been struck, if you listen to local radio around the times of state legislative races, how much of it is about, like, what bills they passed about child molesters. Like, the
fear.
This, like,
fear is the biggest
and this specific kind of fear, I mean, particularly in these intense places of sort of racialized conflict, right? Particularly in, I write in the book about my experience in New York of the both high crime years and the Giuliani years, that this sense that the disorder is constantly at the door, it's constantly threatening your safety and security, and you have to essentially build these kind of walls.
But by the way, I have too many questions for the time we have, but I want to just go a little bit into why crime actually started to decline. Somebody we both know, my son, one of my sons, who's now teaching sociology at Columbia, he told me that there was actually a lot of evidence, and you suggest this in the book, that once we got control over lead-based paint, actually lead poisoning has been proven to have, and poor kids are much more susceptible to it, a kind of an effect on the brain in terms of
self-control.
Self-control.
Yeah.
And once we got some control over lead, that actually, a lot of kids just had more self-control.
So there's a fascinating lead theory that is very contested, but there's some really amazing data. The two main things are paint and gasoline, also, right? So we take the lead out of the gasoline, and there's all sorts of ways in which at the most basic level, the curve of lead in the atmosphere looks a lot like the curve in crime, but pushed like 20 years later.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of like, well, wait a second, those two things kind of match. So there's some evidence for that. There's a lot of evidence that, there's people that make the argument that it was changes in policing. There are people that make the argument that it was the structure of drug markets. There's a lot of, for instance, evidence that there's kind of two different peaks. And the second peak, which is the crack years, that what drove that spike there was that former monopolies were undone by a new market entrant that created smaller, balkanized competitors who used violence to fight over turf.
And it could be several of these. It could be an interaction.
It almost certainly is a bunch of things that came together.
But the broken windows theory of policing, which takes a lot of credit for reducing crime, you have some skepticism about, and I do too.
As someone who has written magazine articles like yourself, and as I have, the broken windows might be the most influential magazine article of all time. I mean, it's as a policy piece. I mean, it was just two people that wrote an article in the Atlantic in 1982. It became the blueprint for policing. I mean, their argument, which is really interesting when you go back to the original text, is police need to get back to order maintenance. That the idea of broken windows is that if there's a window broken in a house or in a car, it sends the message the place is in disrepair, that no one's caring for it. It invites further disorder. Other windows will be broken. And the unraveling of order leads to an unraveling of law.
It's sort of like the Donald Trump theory of running the country, right? It's sort of a broken window.
Donald Trump is 100% a creation of New York in the 80s and 90s, and this mentality. I mean, when you think about the wall, like, what is the wall but not a big broken windows?
Sure.
Right?
Absolutely.
I would say this all the time, if you're, like, if you live in Mahoning County, Ohio, why do you care about the border?
Yeah.
Right?
It's all a symbol.
It is a symbol of disorder, of unraveling, of penetration, right? Of the fact that, like, things are not being put in their place. And if that continues, that's going to really screw everything up. And if you're living in a place that is in material decline, that is undergoing unraveling and genuine social crisis through a decline in living standards and the opioid epidemic, that theory that, like, that disorder over there is causing this disorder over here is very attractive.
And you don't differentiate between the sources of disorder. I mean, to you, everything's falling apart.
Right, that's right.
And that means that if somebody comes along and says, I'm going to impose law and order on them, the Mexicans or Muslims, or I'm going to be tough on black people, I am taking charge and making your life more ordered.
And I think you can't understand the appeal of Trump without understanding the idea of experiencing New York when it was in decline. Decline is so central to the story he tells and central to the lived experience of a swath of voters that he was able to grab, that his experience of New York, I mean, all of the pop culture of the time, right? And the subways are covered in graffiti, and the streets are filled with, drug addicts and public urination, and the place is just falling apart. It's in ruins. You hear when he talks about the country, he is just mapping the New York of the 80s onto the whole country, because that for him was his formative time.
Which is still a big part, as we just said, of what the country now feels.
Yeah.
For slightly different reasons.
Exactly. For different reasons, but what's remarkable about it is you've got this very specific experience, right? Which is New York, which is not, you don't think of New York as being a broadly applicable experience, but the sort of bizarre genius of him politically was to take the specific kind of racialized dynamics of decline of New York in the 80s and 90s and go and find an audience for them in places like McDowell County, West Virginia, Erie County, Pennsylvania, and Mahoning County, Ohio.
And really, Rudy Giuliani and others around
are
him
out there making the case, because
case.
They're armed with this exact same both worldview and rhetoric.
Exactly. And now we get to the question that I've been wanting to ask you. You started off saying, we made this decision. This is a democratic small d decision. Here we have two white guys,
Right.
one old white guy, and one young white guy, and we're talking about this.
Right.
So what do we actually do to change the small d democracy and actually make this country work for everybody?
So one thing is there's lots of points of entrance at this point. So one is, anyone who's watching this, you should get involved in your local district attorney race. Like, who's your local district attorney? What kind of stuff do they do? Is someone running against them? There's now this sort of new generation of challengers to district attorneys, because local prosecutors have a tremendous amount of power. They are extremely low turnout elections. They're places where, with your dollars and your volunteer effort and your vote, you can have a real influence in how the system's being administered at a local level. So
there's the only argument I've ever heard for going to law school.
That's right. Okay. So that's a concrete way to get involved. There's a lot of initiatives happening around things like bail. There's one here in California. There's stuff happening in New York. There are lots of points of entry to go after this system right now. And the kind of amazing thing, particularly at the local level, is they tend to be very low turnout / obscure issues that if you involve yourself in, you're going to have a higher level of leverage than, your voice on tax reform on Capitol Hill.
Right. So even if you're not running for your local prosecutor or district attorney, you can get behind somebody who's a real reformer
and who's going to administer that system in a different way
and has huge leverage. In other words, you can have highest leverage.
That's right.
By doing this kind of stuff that nobody else.
And I can't stress it enough, because I think we tend to talk about things like the crime bill, and most of this is local. Most of it's local. Most of it's being driven by state legislators or local legislators who are elected in fairly low turnout elections. Mm-hmm. And if you make your voice heard on this issue in local elections, you and other people that are like-minded that you organize, you can have a really big effect.
And it's a problem for all of us. It is not something that we can escape from. This is a matter of how our democracy actually works.
That's right. And it also makes us all worse off. I truly believe that. I think we are wasting enormous amount. I mean, aside from the sort of moral commitment we have to each other as full human beings and a shared conception of equal citizenship, in a tangible way, we are just wasting unthinkable amounts of human potential and human capital by constantly dragging people into the system that takes people's talents and frankly moves them in directions that are fundamentally antisocial, right? Because if you start taking people and putting them in the prison system and acculturating them to that, and they're bright or industrious or talented or witty or a million different things, they are going to adapt those tools to survive in that environment, and we are lighting on fire every day in this country unspeakable amounts of human potential.
And it is unfair, it is unjust, it is costly, it is a waste of an amazing potential in this country. And there are things that we can do that have huge leverage.
Yep.
Well, I just want to thank you. This is a great book. One thing I told you I loved about the book is that I learned so much, and you don't feel like you're working.
Good.
It's a great read.
Good.
Chris Hayes.
Thank you. Thank you much.
Thank you for dropping by.